The drive up to Hatcher's Ridge took 40 minutes from the county road. For the first 20 minutes, I told myself I was fine. It was a cold March morning, and I had the heat cranked wide open. The styro cup of gas station coffee was in the cup holder going cold, and I just stopped off the interstate in Knoxville, gassed up the car, bought the coffee, and promptly left it forgotten as I drove closer to the place that I used to call home. The road climbed and switched back so steep, I had to slow to 10 and 15 miles an hour and lean into the wheel. The guardrails on my left were old, bent aluminum, sun-bleached the color of bone, and had seen more than their fair share of fender and firewall scrapes. The gaps in them offered a clear view of the hollow dropping away below. There was 300 feet of bare gray hardwood and shadow below the road, and then I could see nothing else. I watched those gaps every time I passed one. It probably wasn't the safest thing to do, but I couldn't stop myself. I'd made this drive 1,000 times before when I was 18. My hands and body and brain should have known it intimately. The easy lean into each curve, the instinctive lift off the gas before a blind turn, the small anticipatory corrections that became automatic when the road is woven into your muscle memory. But none of that was there anymore. I'd lost it over the years, and I was a stranger navigating a road my body used to know. Lena Cope was a woman who lived a mile farther up the ridge than we had. She lived there as long as I could remember. She's the one who found my father on that Tuesday morning. She hadn't seen smoke from his chimney in 5 days, and anyone knows no smoke from a chimney on Hatcher's Ridge in late February was a bad omen. She called me at 6 in the morning to give me the news. She spoke like a woman who had delivered hard news before and understood the value of directness. I thanked her with words that sounded like my own, but they felt borrowed. And then I sat on the edge of my bed in Columbus, Ohio, and looked at the blank wall until I could stand up and begin the hardest things that I knew I had to do. You know, the things that nobody ever wants to have to do. I'm 33 and, well, I haven't spoken to my father in 4 years. I hadn't been back to the ridge but a handful of times since I was 18, and the last of those visits was over 5 years ago. The 11-hour drive south gave me plenty of time to rehearse explanations I'd been using as excuses for both those facts. The argument we'd had the last time I visited, the things said and not said, the way he had stood in the kitchen doorway watching me load my car with that rigid stillness that said he had made a decision and there was no revisiting it. I told that story so many times, to myself, to others, that I had finally acquired the smooth, worn surface of a true thing. I turned that story over in my head for most of Tennessee, and by the time I reached my childhood home, I still hadn't found the seam where that story stopped being the whole story. The house sat back from the road at the end of a gravel drive, flanked by old cedars gone shaggy and dark with winter. I pulled up and left the engine running. The low porch with the log split railing, the stacked stone chimney on the east side, and the dark windows didn't bring me any sense of nostalgia. It simply looked like a place that had been sealed up against the cold, and then left. After sitting there far too long, I let myself into the house with a key that I hadn't used since I was 16 and had never returned. Dad had never asked me to either. That was his way of letting me know it was okay for me to come back any time without actually voicing the words. It didn't matter though. I never went back. We were both cut from the same strip of stubborn cloth apparently. Maybe that was another story I could tell myself until it felt time. The smell of the house hit me the instant I pushed the door open. It was wood smoke and linseed oil, and the cold mineral scent of a house that has been shut and empty for weeks. And all of that was underneath the unmistakable smell of him. That smell I associated with this kitchen, this man, this life I'd spent 15 years carefully and deliberately moving away from. Had I excised Hatcher's Ridge from me? or vice versa. I wasn't too sure. I stood there and let the feelings wash over me. I let it happen. There was nobody around to see it. Besides, I figured I owed Dad at least that much honesty. His coat still hung on the hook by the door, dark brown with a collar worn pale, a tear in the elbow he'd repaired with a piece of different colored canvas so the patch stood out like a scar. I put my hand on the sleeve. The fabric was stiff with the cold. His boots sat on the mat. If I moved them, the dry mud would fall off in chunks. His reading glasses sat folded on the kitchen table next to a book. A green fabric bookmark had been inserted 3 chapters from the end. He would never finish it, never know how it ended. I thought about that longer than made sense. I think grief finds the smallest available containers first, fills them to overflowing, and then moves on to the next. The house made its old familiar sounds, the tick and groan of wood contracting in the cold, the brittle of the loose storm window in the north bathroom, the intermittent creak of a floor joist that had been talking since I was in elementary school. I had cataloged the sounds as a boy the way children always categorize the sounds of their homes. Each sound had been filed under safe, because known things are safe. Because if you can name the sound, then it has a source, and that source is not a threat. The sounds were unchanged, and they should have been comforting, but they were not. Underneath all that familiar nocturnal talking of the house was the south side, the south woods. It wasn't safe. I didn't sleep well that night. The second night was when I became aware of the silence. I was lying on my bed staring at the water stain on the ceiling that always looked, if you tilted your head and blurred your vision just right, like a hand reaching down for something that it couldn't quite reach. I was in that restless, not quite sleep, of the overexhausted, and then all at once, I was fully awake. Every nerve bristled to attention, but I had no idea what had awakened me. I listened with my breath caught between my lungs and throat. It took almost a full minute before I could identify what was wrong. The wrongness was an absence instead of a presence, and absences are harder to home in on. The Southwood had gone silent. I had grown up listening to these woods at night. The sounds they made weren't dramatic, not the Hollywood trumped-up version of owls calling every 30 seconds and coyotes answering in the distance. It was subtler than that. It was a continuous low-grade acoustic. The creak and sway of the canopy in the wind, the resonant groan that the biggest of the tulip poplars made when a gust moved through them, a sound almost like a plucked cello string that someone allowed to ring. The faint conversation of the laurel thicket when the air moved, a background hiss of wind through 10,000 bare winter branches that sometimes rattled like old bones in a wooden box. Hell, I'd fallen asleep to it for 18 years without once consciously identifying it. The way you never hear the fridge running until it stops. And then the fridge had stopped. From the back field and the south wood tree line that bordered it, there was nothing. Not the reduced sound of still night, but an absolute and pressurized absence of sound. I could feel it in my eardrums. I listened into that, and the more carefully I listened, the more I understood that it was not the silence of an empty place. This was the silence of something very large, very patient, very still and quiet. After a while, I got up. My heart knocked against my ribs with a steadiness that was businesslike. I went and looked out the south window. The moon was a little past half, and the back field was pale and featureless under it. The frozen grass caught the light in a way that made it look like the surface of a still pond. The old fence was a dark thread across the bottom of the field, and the tree line beyond was a solid wall of bare hardwood crowns against the lighter sky. The giant tulip poplars and beeches stood crammed shoulder to shoulder. That kind of density makes you understand why our ancestors were afraid of forests. They weren't afraid of what they might find there. They were afraid of what the forest was on its own terms, without them, without their names for it. I couldn't see anything moving and the field was empty, but at the very edge of my ability to distinguish anything in that darkness, where the tree line and the shadows of the tree line became the same thing, there was an occupation of space that I couldn't resolve into a branch, a person, a tree, a shrub, a shadow, or a trick of the light. It was just a place that was darker than the darkness around it. I stared at that until my eyes burned and watered. The moment I blinked to clear them and looked back, that density was gone, and the tree line was again uniform. I turned on the bedside lamp and I left it on. I didn't look south again until morning, and that was only long enough to reassure myself that the field was empty and the tree line wasn't harboring a slathering monster. On the third day, I walked the property in the thin, cold light of a March morning that never fully committed to brightness. The eastern fields had gone to scrub. It was mostly ragweed, sumac, and the early territorial spread of young cedars. I walked the fence line there mostly for something to do with my body, some physical task that could occupy that part of my mind that kept trying to reconstruct the last conversation that I had with my father. I tried to come up with a version of the last 4 years that I could have navigated differently with him, but I didn't come up with an answer. The old orchard was south of the house and east of the worst of it. Walking into it was like walking into the most coherent artifact of Dad's life. 12 apple trees arranged in 3 rows of 4, their winter crown shaped with patient, reoccurring care that accumulates over a decade into something that looks like it was inevitable. Each tree was pruned to an open center, the branches reaching outward and upward like cupped hands. He had done all of this alone. He had been out there every spring by himself, tending and pruning and caring for the orchard, and it showed. I stood there longer than I meant to, and then I moved farther south. The south field sloped away from the house in a long, gradual grade that narrowed as it went, pinched between 2 spurs of the ridge, until, at its lowest point, it was about 40 feet wide and butted up to the old-growth timber in a seam so clean it looked like an intentional boundary someone had surveyed and marked. Old cedar fence posts stood at even intervals, and between them, the wire had gone slack and rusty, sagging in long curves between each post. The gate in the middle had come off of one hinge so long ago that it had just been wired shut and left. I stopped at the fence and I peered into the timber. The temperature dropped the instant I was within 10 feet of the tree line. The chill hit my face, and then found the gaps in my collar and worked its way to the back of my neck. I shivered. My body registered the warning before my mind did, and I pulled my dad's coat on tighter. Old growth looks different from second growth. Log forests grow back dense and competitive, a lot of small trees and shrubs fighting each other for light, and the understory is choked with the losers. Old growth has time to sort itself out. The big trees stand 40, 60, hell 80 feet apart, their trunks rising clean and enormous, and the space between them at ground level is open and dark. My father's south wood had beech trees. The 5 that I could see were each 4 or 5 feet across, their bark smooth and gray, almost metallic, catching what light came between the bare bones canopy and holding it with the dim luminescence. Between them, the understory was mountain laurel and rhododendron, brown and winter dead, compressed into thickets so dense they were like walls. The leaf litter on the floor was deep and undisturbed, and it was so quiet in there that the mere idea of sound seemed inappropriate, irreverent, like talking loud in a church. No wind moved inside the tree line. Outside, at my back, the field grass and the scrub moved together in a light gust. The cedar fence posts creaked, my jacket shifted against itself, but inside, nothing. The dead laurel didn't move. The leaf litter lay perfectly intact. I felt something looking back at me. There wasn't a specific thing I could point to, but the feeling of being watched with great care and contemplation made my nerves prickle along my neck and shoulders. It was that ancient sense of being assessed by a predator that we never lost. It was a primal instinct that was impossible to brush off or ignore. Hell, I'd felt it before, but never at that intensity. While I was trying to work out whether my grieving brain was making shit up, a sound came from inside the South Forest, not far from where I stood. I want to be very clear about what I'm about to say. It wasn't a voice. There were no words or language, not even the tonal shape of a particular person's speech. But it was the mechanical preparation that precedes speech, the configuration of a human throat, the slight intake of a breath, the subtle click of a palate positioning itself. The way a voice sounds in the quarter second before it commits a word. Hell, it registered in both ears at fractionally different times, which is how you know something is localized rather than ambient. My eyes darted back and forth, up and down, but hell, I saw nothing. But then it stopped. Just cut off cleanly, as if whatever had been about to speak had reconsidered its actions. The sound had come from between the second and third beech trees where the laurel was thickest. Something was there at the very edge of what I could see, just like it had been when I saw it from the bedroom window the prior night. It was a dark density. That's the best way I can describe it. And the longer I stared, the less certain I became that I was staring at anything at all. The less certain I became, the more certain I felt. I let go of the fence railing and walked swiftly back up the field to the house at a pace I'm not going to describe as running, though I will say that my heart was at full sprint the entire way. And when I got inside, I put my back to the counter and stood there several minutes before it slowed. Lena Cope came the next afternoon with a covered casserole dish and the bearing of a woman steeling herself for difficult conversation. She knocked twice, short, decisive raps. When I opened the door, she looked at me with an expression of someone who has already sized up the situation from a distance and is simply confirming what she already knew. She was small, thin, somewhere in her mid-60s, with a white hair cut close to her head, and sharp, quick brown eyes that moved over the room, checking the corners and shadowy spots as she stepped in. She wore laced-up boots with heavy lug soles and a wool coat the color of wrought iron. She carried herself with the controlled stillness of a person who's used to not showing what they're feeling. I noticed that when she sat down, she put her back to the north wall, but never once in over an hour did she even glance at the largest source of light, that window looking out to the south. When her gaze wasn't on me, it was on one of the doorways or the window over the sink. She did this enough that I figured it was something she mastered over the years of perhaps visiting my father. She had told me about the timber, well, the Southwood specifically, the 5 or 6 acres of old growth that had never been logged, had never been touched as long as anyone on the ridge could account for, and that some families on the ridge had been quietly, consistently, keeping their distance from that for generations. Well, I had many questions, as you could probably imagine. She told me what lived in those woods had been there before the families, before the roads that connected the ridge to the world below, and possibly before the name that had been given to these mountains. "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward and almost feeling like a naive kid believing in the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus, except I had felt this thing when she spoke about it. "What does it want? Why is it here?" I sat back. Lena smiled, a tight little smile. "No, never mind," I said, shaking my head. "There's nothing really out there, it's just my head." I stood and swirled a finger by my temple. "It's just all messed up because of Dad." I couldn't finish the sentence, though. I couldn't say it aloud, or even make it real, and I'm not sure I accepted his death as a reality to begin with. The finality of it was too much for me. "Caleb, sit," Lena said. I sat. "I'm sorry. It's just that with everything going on now and Dad's... Well, I just know those old stories are told to keep the kids out of the deep woods, to keep them safe." I rambled quickly. She let me finish, and when I had exhausted my explanation, she smiled again. "It doesn't feed on anything, doesn't defend anything, and has no needs that anyone has ever identified. It listens." I chuckled dryly. "Well, at least we know it ain't a teenager." I slipped right back into the mountain vernacular without realizing it. Lena ignored my attempt at dry humor. "Well, not the way you're listening to me, child," she said, watching my face, not waiting for gaps to respond. "It listens the way water listens to stone, without urgency, without distraction, for as long as it takes to know every surface. Hell, it sits in that dark timber, and it absorbs everything that it reaches. Mostly the people who live at the edges of its territory, though. The sounds they make when they're alone, working, talking to themselves, crying, praying, arguing with other people who aren't in the room. Well, over enough time." She paused, turning her coffee mug over in her hands. "Over enough time, it doesn't just have a copy of a voice. It has the whole interior of a person. Every grief, every register of fear. You know, the way a voice changes when the speaker is telling the truth versus a lie." She set the mug down, and then it speaks from that. Cold pit had formed in my gut and spread throughout my whole torso on the familiarity of what she was telling me. That logical part of my brain wanted to reject and laugh at her story, but the other part, the primal part that hasn't yet forced feelings to be either logical or illogical, that part knew the truth and was sending the signals to the rest of me. "Calls people, I think," I said in a voice that was almost a whisper, and she nodded. "Using whatever voice, words, and weight of emotion it has learned will move that particular person. It doesn't guess, it just knows. Well, it's been listening to you long enough to understand exactly what you most need to hear, and from whose mouth and what tone." She looked at her weathered hands. "Well, it's not malicious as far as I could tell. Well, I don't think it has the mental states that Wheeze does. I think it does what it does the way a river kinda goes with the flow. Because that's just what it is. It's what it's designed for. Not because we chose it to." "What happens to the people who answer its call then?" I asked. I mean, wasn't that the reason I'd let go of the fence rail and almost ran back to the house? Because I'd been sorely tempted to go over that sagging, rusted fence and to investigate that dark density. Find out what it was that I was seeing. To utter some meaningless greeting and see if whatever was there would answer back. Yeah, that's why I ran. Some memory tried to surface from childhood, and when it didn't, all I was left with was an unshakable fear. A warning that seemed hardwired into me. Her jaw tightened. "Aldous Greer. I have the story third hand because it was in my granny's time, but she wasn't a woman who exaggerated, and well, just like you, I thought it was a story to make kids stay close to home. For years, I believed that. Anyway, Aldous Greer lived on the far side of the ridge with his son Thomas. Well, Thomas died in a logging accident. It was fast, and with no time for the people to register shock or hell anything else. But that thing out there had been listening to both of them for years, apparently. And about 8 months after Thomas had died, it started using his voice, calling from the Southwood at dusk for his father." "What did it say?" I asked, my throat constricting. "Whatever a dead son might say to his father. Come see, I'm here, just over here." Her voice was flat and careful. "Aldous Greer held out for almost a year, and when he finally did break, he didn't just go into the woods. Oh, hell no, child. He simply answered from the porch, called Thomas's name, and my granny said that when she came by the next morning, Aldous Greer was just sitting in a chair in his front room, awake, his eyes wide open, with words just spilling right out of him. They weren't loud or frantic, but just continuously in a low voice, saying things not directed at anyone or anything in the room. She said it was like someone doing a very good imitation of Algis Greer that was just imprecise enough to make her skin go all willy-like. Well, he didn't eat or sleep, as far as anybody could tell. But he had to have eaten, at least because he lived that way for, I don't know, about 6 months. Just talking quiet and steady like, wandering his property. Everybody in town thought he was nuts. They'd seen him wandering aimlessly and just talking to the air. His eyes never really focused after that. But none of them ever approached him or spoke to him to say, "Oh, hey, Algis, how you doing?" you know? And I think that's what it wanted. And when I say I think that's what it wanted, I think that's what the Southwood wanted. I think it was on a mission to lure in more people. I stared at the table. Are you trying to tell me that this thing is really real and it collects people by, what, using their voices? I don't know if that's exactly right, but yeah, I mean, in a sense, that's exactly what it does. But why? I mean, what's the purpose? She thought for a long moment. Well, I think maybe this entity is bound to the Southwood in its current form. Well, it's not a form, it's more formless, is, well, I guess what I'm trying to say. You know, a specter, a ghoul, a ghost, perhaps. Well, around here we call them haints. But when it connects with a human, particularly a person who is suffering, it inhabits that person. Well, it sounds more like a demon possessing people if you ask me. I said flatly. I was unsure how I felt about the whole thing. She nodded. Well, I guess when you put it that way, well, it sounds about right. And what is a demon's purpose? Without thinking about it, I said what everybody on the ridge had always held about demons. Well, you know, to inhabit a human body so it can experience life on Earth, the way we do, except it wants to experience the least godly and least righteous things so that it completely destroys its host. I looked up, shocked. Holy shit. It's a demon out there, isn't it? She sighed and looked to the doorway as if contemplating running out of it. Well, now, Caleb, your father Raymond held the rules about never answering this thing in his whole life. It called to him in his dead mother's voice, then in his wife's voice, your mama. He told me those voices were easier for him to hold against. Your grandmama and your mother were already dead. He had had plenty of time to grieve them and put them to rest. He was good at ignoring those voices, so it stopped using them. Her eyes were clear, and her expression was severe. And they used mine instead, didn't they? I said. Every single goddamn night, calling his name in your voice. Well, after a while, it was more than just his name. It was just sporadic things. The way you would say goodbye when you left for college, the things from your last visit, he told me. Her tone dropped. Well, that argument, the exact words, but softened just slightly. She looked at me with real sorrow. You know, he told me it was the hardest thing he'd held against. Where his wife and mother were dead, but you were still alive, and he thought still reachable. And every night it was offering him a version of you that had come back, that was ready to fix whatever you two had broken. The grief that welled up in me was not clean. It was tangled up with guilt and anger, and the shame of having let someone correctable calcify into something permanent. And for a moment, I couldn't even speak. You know, he held every time to the end, Lena said quietly. Beholding cost them. She touched the table with 2 fingers. And I think the last sound he heard before his heart stopped was probably the sound of your voice. After Lena left, I sat in Dad's chair in the kitchen and let the memories surface that had tried to rise up at the fence line. I hadn't looked directly at it in 21 years. I was 12 at the time, and it was one of those July evenings where the heat persisted long after the sun went down. The thick canopy and the mountain air held on to heat longer than it should have been able to, and the kitchen was warm even with the windows open. The smell of honeysuckle on the north fence came in on every breeze. My grandmother was at the sink washing supper dishes, and I was beside her drying them. We were talking about nothing in particular. A neighbor, a new cow Mr. Johnson bought the previous week, a fair coming up in town. We talked comfortably and lowly. Through the open south window, I could hear the sounds of a normal summer night, crickets and the hum of insects. Normal sounds that had been in the background of every summer night that I'd spent in the house. And then, from the direction of the south field, my mother's voice called to me. It was that specific way she called me in for supper when I'd gone for hours, and she was getting irritated, but wasn't quite angry yet. I'd heard her yell the same way for me hundreds of times, but my mother was standing 3 feet from me with the dishes in her hands. The glass I held went weightless in my hands, or I lost the sense of weight entirely. Some fundamental input into my nervous system had dropped out. The hair on my arm stood up hard enough to hurt. My mouth opened, and I had already inhaled to answer her. It was the reflexive response to being called that's built in so deep it bypasses thought entirely. My grandmother's hand clamped over my mouth, and she stared sternly into my eyes. She shook her head once, nodding to the glass still in my hands, and dropped her hand from my mouth slowly as if she would raise it again if I tried to speak. "Don't make a sound. Y'all just keep drying," she told me in a voice so low it almost wasn't a voice at all. My mother then went absolutely rigid. She stood with a stack of dishes in her hands, eyes forward, not looking at anything. From outside, the voice again, and mingled with it, or maybe just underneath it, was something I couldn't identify at 12. That I can most certainly identify now. It wasn't the mild impatience of a mother calling a child into supper for the 2nd or 3rd time. It was patience. Grandma kept washing and Mother kept not looking at the window, and, well, I kept drying those dishes. The voice came a 3rd time, and then a 4th, and then it stopped. Grandma dried her hands on her apron and said, "You could put that up now, Caleb." And I put it up, and nobody said another word about it that night, or ever again. Mom died when I was 15. Grandma died when I was 22. On my 4th night there, the voice came. I'd slept badly all week, only catching an hour here or there before jerking fully awake. That night was the same, and I was somewhere in the lightest stage of sleep when something pulled me all the way up. I lay there, eyes open, knowing I'd been awake by a sound I had missed. A sound that wasn't present any longer, but whose shape might still be in the room. The clock said it was 1:14 a.m. The radio I'd started leaving on in the kitchen talked to itself at the edge of earshot, and then from the outside of the south window, from somewhere in the backfield, my father's voice yelled for me. It was his voice completely. The slight elongation of certain vowels that I had spent years sanding out of my own speech in an effort to sound like somebody who hadn't grown up here. "Well, I'm sorry, son. I should have said that while I still could. I was on my feet then. Not a conscious choice or effort. Hell, my body made that decision." And in a moment later, I was out that south window with my hands reaching for the latch. My grandmother's hand clamped over my mouth from behind. Not literally, of course. I mean, she'd been dead for 11 years, but the memory of her hand was so physically present that my own hand stopped moving and I stood stock still. "Don't make a sound." I pressed both hands over my mouth hard enough that I felt the shape of my teeth through my lips. From outside, there was nothing but silence. It had relocated much closer, perhaps even to the porch side of the fence, or closer still. I held my breath and counted until the clock's red digits changed from 1:17 to 1:18. Then the breathing started. I sat on the floor with my back to the bed, knees pulled up to my chest, and I watched the clock. At 2:30, the breathing was still there. It was unchanged. At 4:10, I had a long moment where I was unsure if I was dreaming. I went to the window, and on the exterior of the glass, centered at the height of a standing person's face, the winter frost had been cleared in 2 narrow strips. I went outside and stood with my face near them. They landed just under my nose. I hadn't been dreaming or hallucinating or imagining the thing breathing outside the window. It had been there. But when the temperature rose, the evidence would surely be lost. I called Lena later on in the morning to tell her what happened. She said I needed to leave. "Today, before dark," she said. "I'm not finished with..." "Doesn't matter. You need to get off the mountain before dark. Something's changed in that thing's behavior. Coming out of the woods, standing at your window for hours? Well, child, it doesn't do that. It calls from the tree line and it waits. It knows you don't live here anymore. Huh, maybe it wants you so it could leave with you. Broaden its range. Well, it only calls at night. I'll be gone by then." "No, it calls from the darkness. And there's a big difference there, Caleb. Any darkness where it can move, it can call from. It's just more active at night because of that fact, but it exists in the shadowed places. It can be active in daylight if there's a shadow or darkness it can reach." "Well, thanks, but that doesn't make me feel any better." "The only thing that'll keep you safe is that rule. It's the only protection that's ever worked. You don't answer. Not a single word, gasp, nothing. Not a single sound. A clearly voiced, freely given response to it establishes a connection it can't establish any other way. And once it's got that, well then distance stops being the protection it is right now. So go before you break the rule. Get out of here. Leave Hatcher's Ridge and don't come back." I thanked her and told her I was leaving, and I'd be gone before dark. I had my bag over one shoulder and my keys in hand. I was reaching for the back door handle when footsteps came around the side of the house. The footfalls came into the narrow space between the back wall and the cedar hedge lining the drive, and the thing that had made them came into the deepening evening light. From a distance, say from my living room window, I might have accepted it as a man, but at 15 feet, I couldn't do that. My initial shock at the sight of the thing held me still. Its smell hit me next. It was wet earth. Its throat moved and the mouth drooped open, hanging as if on a broken hinge. "You should have come here sooner, son." My father's voice coming from that thing stopped me in my tracks. Then it shifted and my heart leaped into my throat, and before I could move, my voice came out of it. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this." "What?" One syllable, a reflex and involuntary articulation of shock. The beginning of a word ripped out of me before the rule could close my mouth. The thing's head snapped toward the sound. For what seemed like hours, we stared at each other through 5 yards of cold air. It was beyond grotesque, this creature. Pale skin, dark eyes, humanoid and zombie-like, it stayed completely still. But I ran. My bag was still on my shoulder, my keys in my hand. I ran across the porch, down the step, and across the gravel to the car. I was in the car with the engine running before I'd fully closed the door. I backed around in the gravel, and I put it in drive. I didn't even look back in the rear view because some part of me understood I would see my own face looking back at me from the driveway. I drove all the way back to Ohio, and things were good for a bit, but only for about 2 days. And then one evening I was sitting in a chair, and I completely understood what I had done. One simple rule: don't answer. At the house on Hatcher's Ridge, I had needed to believe that the word I uttered in shock wasn't enough, and I had given it a fragment and not a foundation. But then outside of my 3rd-story window, "Caleb?" My father's voice. I didn't go to the window. I didn't answer. I sat in the chair with my hands on my lap, my eyes on my lamp, and I held to the rule. The thing knows where I am. It's been here since I left the ridge, is my guess. It won't be at the window forever. I know that much. But it is persistent and it is patient. I hold the rule now. For now. But the voice is getting louder, and it's getting more demanding. And I haven't slept in such a long, long time.